Murdock's Music Minute, the meeting place for the nicest side issue in the world, guitar-based popular music, the shabby channel where you get album reviews, discography rankings and all that jazz in a thick accent. For today's issue, I've planned something more special. Just a few weeks ago, critically dubious emo alternative power poppers Weezer have released their third season. This year they are pursuing a project based on the 4 seasons, 4 EPs, each one dedicated to one of the seasons, and now it's the time for the Autumn EP. Well, the shadows are getting longer, the nights are colder and darker. It is the cozy time of the year. Autumn or fall, whichever way you prefer it, is upon us. And that made me think of certain or special albums I especially turn to during the time of autumn. So, to do something else, something different this time, I thought, why not present 10 albums that I personally specifically associate with the season of the falling leaves and the ripened fruits. You will see that this is not the time for heavy or amplified guitars. When the autumn comes, I usually tend to prefer stuff that falls into the categories of either acoustic singer-songwriter or folk rock, which may sound a bit strange to some experts because, especially in British folk rock, the songs tend to rather focus on the merry month of May instead of golden September, the rainy October, or the grim and misty November. But hey, that's just me. Maybe you've got your own genres or special music that you connect to certain seasons. So what's your autumn music? Is it the acoustic, cozy stuff? Is it disturbing and depressive post-punk? Or bubbling electronica? Whatever. In this video, I'm just going to present you my 10 special autumn albums. They don't come in any specific order. This is not a ranking. So I hope you just have a little fun with this seasonal episode of Murdock's Music Minute. So here we go. Clannets were a folk band consisting of siblings and their uncles from Ireland. In the early 80s, their youngest sister or niece briefly joined the band, a girl called Anya, who very soon would become a star in her own right in the more new age pop scene. Dullaman, however, is the third Clannad album from 1976 without Anya, and at that point the group were still very strictly traditional folk, however with a bit of a jazzy undercurrent. You don't get any electrified instruments on this album. What you'll hear instead is acoustic guitar, flutes, double bass, Celtic harp, and what's most important, the often fairy tale-like harmony vocals. What's also important to know is that most of these songs are sung in Irish Gaelic, which still sounds very outlandish to my ears, but equally beautiful. Listening to this album feels like sitting around a bonfire, listening to fairy tales and magical stories from the olden days, a breeze from the sea is coming in. This is a wonderful, evocative folk album. Steeleye Band's All Around My Head was released in 1975. Steeleye Band at that point were an institution of British or English folk rock, and this was their commercially most successful and accessible album. It brought them their biggest hit, title track, All Around My Head. On this album, folk and rock indeed go together in more or less equal measures. It's an album mostly based on traditionals that are, however, really amped up a few levels with electric guitars. All Around My Head and also the song Hard Times of Old England, for example, sound as if Status Quo had decided to make a folk record. This is a really fun record. It takes you to the forests and the woodlands. You get a story from Robin Hood, an evil elf queen, a ghost story based on the traditional wife of Usher's Well, and also the anthem for every single man, Bachelor's Hall, hardly politically correct these days. However, for me, this is an extremely autumnal but upbeat album. Steeleye Band's sound is mostly defined by the typical folky fiddle that gets contrasted by some really cranky electric guitars and the distinct voice of main vocalist Maddie Pryor.
Time has told me.
How could somebody compile an autumn album list without Nick Drake? Today he is celebrated as a kind of cult star. During his, unfortunately, way too short lifetime, he was hopelessly unsuccessful due to his shyness, some mental matters, but also maybe lack of support from the record label. Actually, he only left us 3 albums that were released during his lifetime. 5 Leaves Left is the debut album by Nick Drake. And compared to the other 2 albums that followed, it is still the most traditionally singer-songwriter folky album. However, it already shows that Nick Drake added a different flavor to the whole genre. It has some jazzy touches, it is at times a bit bluesy, and then there are also some very lush but also dramatic, melancholic orchestral arrangements on this album. The title 5 Leaves Left actually does not refer to the falling leaves in the fall, but to cigarette papers. There was a certain cigarette paper brand that had this notice in their packages telling clients that they were actually running out of stock. So just, 5 leaves left to roll your cigarette. The album is filled with wonderful singer-songwriter folk. Of course, it is more melancholic as everything in Nick Drake's small oeuvre. Some tracks I'd like to mention are the wonderful Time Has Told Me or the Cello Song, but then there are also rather mysterious and really shattering, almost depressing tunes such as Fruit Tree or Riverman. If you are a fan or a follower of the idea of beauty in sadness, Nick Drake's albums are just the right thing for you. As an honorable mention, in general, if you fall for this kind of singer-songwriter folk with touches of jazz, I also recommend you to listen to the American singer-songwriter Shannon Lay, especially her latest album, Geist, released in 2021. Divine Comedy are the top address if you like your indie pop, very orchestral, played with grandeur and lavish arrangements. The Divine Comedy are basically a one-man project by the great songwriter Neil Hannon from Northern Ireland. Absent Friends is actually one of his later records. It is one of the most orchestral works by the Divine Comedy, and it is filled with wonderful tunes, almost like songs from a stage play or a musical, but filled with a healthy dose of irony, but also melancholia. A lot of these songs are about loss of friends, loss of people, or simply mortality as such. However, this album is not necessarily a depressing affair. There are some really fun indie pop tunes as well, such as Come Home, Billy Bird, or The Happy Goth. Like many Divine Comedy albums, it flirts with a certain bookishness or highbrow attitude. There are a lot of references to literature, for instance, Oscar Wilde or Charles Dickens in the wonderful string-based song Our Mutual Friend. If you've never heard of the Divine Comedy, seek out this album. It is a wonderful companion to lying on your chaise longue and reading some 19th century classics. Hergest Ridge from 1974 is Mike Oldfield's second album. It followed the hugely successful Tubular Bells and is the predecessor to the equally celebrated and beloved Omadhaun. Hergest Ridge saw Mike Oldfield in a bit of a crisis. He was more or less overwhelmed with the sudden success of his debut, Tubular Bells. He suffered from panic attacks and a kind of writer's block and crisis as an artist, and took refuge in the area of Hergest Ridge, a huge hill at the border between England and Wales. This second album is filled with more slowly evolving passages. It is almost meditative, very folk influenced, but also with traces of what would later be called New Age music. It may not be as exciting as Tubular Bells or as enchanting as Omadhaun. However, this album to me sounds like the perfect soundtrack for a walk on a misty autumn day. It is filled with choirs, flutes, very pensive passages, acoustic guitar, oboe, except for a sudden outbreak in the second part on the B side, where Oldfield overdubbed hundreds of electric guitars to create a kind of very menacing, powerful wall of noise.
Ironclad feather feet pounding the dust on October's day towards evening.
Jethro Tull's 1978 album Heavy Horses to me is their perfect autumn album, not only because October is mentioned in the lyrics of the title track. The music here is rustic and earthen, very folk rocky with a little bit of prog thrown in, and it sounds like the soundtrack to walking besides the autumn acres and then maybe later coming home after a walk through the cold for a nice cup of tea or maybe a wee dram of whiskey. Anderson here tells stories of rural life. A lot of the songs are about or referencing animals. He sings in a very earthen, masculine voice. and of course there are folk fiddles and mandolins scattered all over this album. The title track is a wonderful, melancholic testament to the old style of agriculture. There are songs like Rover or One Brown Mouse that depict the coziness of rural life, but also more menacing tracks such as No Lullaby. If you're looking for an album to play while sitting by the fireside in a small pub somewhere in the countryside, Heavy Horses is the one to turn to. And if you'd like to hear me talk more about Jethro Tull, don't hesitate to check out my super lengthy Jethro Tull discography ranking video that I'll link up here. Yes, for this one I'll get my glasses back on to make it look a little bit more seriously. After all this folk stuff, some really distorted guitars. Type O Negative's October Rust. An album I bought as in my late teenager years, I think. And this is gothic metal with the tongue firmly planted in cheek. Type O Negative always had a notoriety about them, but they also have a really twisted sense of humor, which comes to the fore on this album. October Rust is most certainly their most accessible, almost commercial album, at least compared to their other releases. The music here is heavy and slow and plodding, and of course it is filled with gothic sounds and atmosphere, but underneath there's also a certain pop sensibility. Of course there is a lot of corniness or cheesiness also going on, as you can read from song titles such as Be My Druidess, Love You to Death, or the incredible title The Glorious Liberation of the People's Technocratic Republic of Vinland by the Combined Forces of the United Territories of Europa. An album you can put on if you are planning on some kinky one-on-one action for Halloween. However, there is, at least to my ears, some artistic value to the whole proceedings here. Sometimes this album actually sounds as if Pink Floyd had suddenly morphed into a kind of alternative or, yes, gothic metal band. And if listened to in the right mood, this can be all some great fun or some dark blanket for your death-longing soul. Justin Sullivan is better known as the head and singer of alternative indie post-punk heroes New Model Army. He has released a few solo albums, at least I think 2, and Navigating by the Stars deals with the theme of sailing the sea, ships and the ocean. But we're not talking about surfing in California or Australia here. This album really evokes the stormy North Sea with salty air, roaring waves and thunderstorms. A lot of these songs are about ships, heavy weather conditions and some brooding atmosphere. The music is a kind of dark singer-songwriter folk, and this alone makes it the perfect album to put on during a rainy or stormy day in autumn. Autumn can also be, of course, sunny and golden, and The band to provide the right sound for this kind of autumn are Fleet Foxes. Their second album, Helplessness Blues, is a perfect example of how to put the golden leaves of autumn into music. This album combines a certain sadness with absolute joy, wonderful harmony vocals, and a sort of slightly psychedelic folk pop or folk rock that is also very much informed by the 1960s. There's also room for a little bit of experimentation, and even though the debut album by Fleet Foxes might be their most enchanting one and strangely ancient sounding one, Helplessness Blues maybe is, as an overall piece of art, their best work to date. By the time Scotland's Travis rose to fame, Britpop was slowly fading, so that Travis became the forerunners of a kind of second wave of Britpop, or maybe even post-Britpop. Their music was shamelessly accessible, but not as twee as maybe fellow Scotsman Bell and Sebastian, but also not as anthemic and bombastic as Coldplay would get later on. On this album, the dreary feeling of walking through the rain becomes a kind of credo for your whole life, or a kind of general attitude, and this makes it probably very, very Scottish, but also very autumnal. There is a constant melancholia gliding through these, as I said, very accessible, rather mid to slow tempo and sometimes even quite plodding tunes. However, Travis here turned this concept into some lovely and, well, in some sense, anthemic guitar ballads. Writing to Reach You is a wonderful opening track. Turn is a powerful slow rocker, and then of course there are songs like Driftwood or the very famous Why Does It Always Rain on Me. What could be better to listen to in autumn than this album? 10 albums and altogether too much tea. Thanks for listening. See you in another video.